What happens when one of music's most provocative voices sits down for what should be a standard morning show interview, only to have the entire conversation spiral into one of the most uncomfortable exchanges in recent television history? The clash between Miley Cyrus and CBS Sunday morning host Tracy Smith has sent shockwaves through social media, with clips of their heated exchange racking up millions of views in just hours. Before we break down every explosive moment of this interview, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and drop a comment below telling me what you think really went wrong here. Now let's get into what actually happened during this interview that has everyone talking. The interview started innocently enough, with Tracy Smith welcoming Miley onto the show to discuss her latest album and her evolution as an artist. But within the first few minutes, the tone shifted dramatically. Tracy opened with a question about Miley's public image, specifically referencing her transformation from Disney star to her more controversial phases. The question itself seemed standard for celebrity interviews, touching on the journey from Hannah Montana to the artist she is today. But it was the way Tracy framed it that immediately put Miley on edge. Tracy asked, looking back at some of your more, let's say, shocking moments in the public eye, do you ever feel like you went too far? That maybe some of those choices were more about getting attention than authentic self-expression? The studio audience went quiet. You could see Miley's expression change instantly. Her smile faded, and she leaned forward slightly in her chair. There was a pause, a long one, where she seemed to be carefully considering her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was measured, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. I think that's an interesting way to phrase that question, Tracy. Miley began, because what you're essentially asking me is whether I was being fake, whether I was performing for shock value rather than being myself. And I have to push back on that because it assumes that you know my intentions better than I do. Tracy tried to clarify, saying she wasn't questioning Miley's authenticity, just asking about her perspective looking back. But Miley wasn't letting it go. She continued, her voice gaining strength and conviction with each word. No, I hear what you're saying, but the question itself carries a judgment. You're asking if I went too far, which implies that there's a line I crossed that you've decided exists. Who gets to decide what's too far? Who gets to decide what's authentic and what's for attention? Because from where I'm sitting, everything I've done has been a reflection of where I was at that moment in my life. The tension in the studio was palpable now. Tracy shifted in her seat, clearly not expecting this level of pushback. She attempted to move forward by acknowledging that artists evolve, but then made what many viewers would later call a critical mistake. She brought up specific examples, referencing performances and public appearances that had generated controversy, essentially doubling down on her original premise. But surely you can understand why some people, parents especially, felt betrayed when you made such a dramatic shift from the wholesome image you had as Hannah Montana, Tracy said. There were young fans who looked up to you, and then suddenly you're doing things that their parents didn't want them seeing. Miley's jaw visibly tightened. She took a breath before responding, and when she did, her words came out with barely contained frustration. Okay, so now we're talking about betrayal. Tracy, I was a child when I played Hannah Montana. I was a teenager growing up in front of the entire world, under a microscope, with millions of people thinking they had a say in who I should be and how I should behave. The fact that I played a character on a TV show didn't mean I owed anyone my entire life and identity. I didn't sign a contract to stay frozen as that character forever. Tracy attempted to interject, to clarify that she wasn't suggesting Miley owed anyone anything, but Miley was on a roll now, her passion and frustration pouring out. No, let me finish, Miley said, her voice rising slightly. This is important because it speaks to something bigger than just me. We put child stars in this impossible position where we expect them to grow up in public, but only in ways that we approve of. We want them to evolve, but not too much. We want them to be authentic, but only if that authenticity fits into a neat, comfortable box that doesn't challenge anyone. The camera cut to Tracy, who looked visibly uncomfortable. She tried to steer the conversation by acknowledging that growing up in the spotlight must be difficult, but her words came across as dismissive, as if she was trying to placate Miley rather than genuinely engage with what she was saying. I understand it must have been challenging, but don't you think there's a difference between growing up and making artistic choices versus deliberately courting controversy? Tracy asked. That question, according to social media reactions later, was the match that lit the fuse. Miley's expression went from frustrated to genuinely angry. She leaned back in her chair and let out a short, incredulous laugh. Deliberately courting controversy, Miley repeated slowly, letting the words hang in the air. You say that like you know my heart, like you were in the room when I made every decision about my career and my art. You say that like my only motivation could possibly be to shock people, as if I'm incapable of having deeper reasons for the choices I make. Tracy tried to walk it back, insisting she didn't mean to imply anything about Miley's character, but the damage was done. Miley wasn't accepting the olive branch. No, you know what? I think you did mean to imply something, Miley said, her voice steady but intense. This whole line of questioning has been leading somewhere. And now we're here. You think I was performing, putting on a show, being provocative for provocative's sake. And maybe that's easier for people to believe than accepting that I'm a complex human being who is figuring herself out, making mistakes, taking risks, and yes, sometimes pushing boundaries, because that's what artists do. The interview had now completely derailed from whatever publicists and producers had planned. Tracy attempted to regain control of the conversation by suggesting they take a different direction and talk about Miley's recent work, but Miley wasn't ready to let the previous exchange go. "We can talk about my recent work, absolutely," Miley said, "but I think we need to address the elephant in the room first. This interview was supposed to be about my music, about my growth as an artist, about the work I'm proud of now. Instead, we've spent the first several minutes relitigating my past and essentially asking me to apologize for choices I made years ago. Choices that, by the way, I don't regret." Tracy's response to this was to suggest that part of being in the public eye means being open to discussing all aspects of one's career, including the controversial moments. It was a reasonable point in theory, but in this context, it came across as deflecting rather than addressing Miley's concerns. "Of course, I'm open to discussing my career," Miley countered, "but there's a difference between discussing and being interrogated. There's a difference between asking someone about their journey and implying that parts of that journey were mistakes or calculated stunts. You're not approaching this conversation with curiosity, you're approaching it with judgment." The audience, which had been silent throughout most of this exchange, began to shift uncomfortably. A few scattered murmurs could be heard. Tracy, looking flustered now, insisted that there was no judgment, that she was simply asking questions that many viewers might have. "And there it is," Miley said, pointing at Tracy but not in an aggressive way. More as if she was identifying something she'd been waiting to hear. "You're hiding behind the audience, behind the viewers, behind this idea that you're just asking what everyone wants to know. But who decided those are the questions worth asking? Who decided that my value as an interview subject is tied to how much I'm willing to defend or explain away my past?" Tracy attempted to reframe once again, stating that understanding an artist's journey, including the controversial parts, helps audiences connect with their current work. But Miley wasn't buying it. "You know what helps audiences connect with current work?" Miley responded, her tone sharp. "Talking about the current work, playing the music, discussing the creative process. Not spending 20 minutes asking me to justify who I was 5, 10 years ago. You want to understand my journey, then ask me about where I am now, what I'm creating now, what matters to me now. Don't use my journey as code for interrogating my past." Tracy looked directly at the camera, then back at Miley, seemingly trying to decide how to proceed. When she spoke again, there was a defensive quality to her voice that hadn't been there at the start of the interview. "Miley, I think you're being a bit unfair here. These are standard questions that we ask many artists who have had, let's call it, eventful careers. We're not singling you out." Miley's eyes widened at that response. She shook her head slowly, and when she spoke, there was a mix of disbelief and frustration in her voice. "Standard questions," she repeated. "You know what's interesting about that? Male artists who reinvent themselves, who push boundaries, who do controversial things, they get asked about their genius, their evolution, their artistic vision. Women who do the same thing get asked if they went too far, if they regret it, if they were doing it for attention. That's not standard, that's a double standard." The comment hung in the air, and you could see Tracy processing it. Clearly not prepared for the conversation to take this turn. She started to object, to provide examples of male artists who face similar scrutiny, but Miley cut her off. "Please don't do that. Don't sit here and pretend that the way we talk about men and women in this industry is the same. You know, it's not. I know it's not. Everyone watching knows it's not. When a male artist is provocative, he's daring, he's edgy, he's challenging norms. When a woman does it, she's desperate, she's troubled, she's going through a phase. The language is different, the framing is different, the entire conversation is different." Tracy attempted to push back, suggesting that perhaps Miley was being oversensitive, that not everything is about gender. The moment those words left her mouth, you could see several people in the audience react, some shaking their heads, others looking at each other with raised eyebrows. "Oversensitive," Miley said quietly, almost to herself. Before looking back up at Tracy, "That's another one of those words that gets thrown at women when they push back, when they refuse to just smile and nod through questions that are designed to put them on the defensive. I'm not being oversensitive, Tracy. I'm being clear. I'm being direct. And apparently, that's making you uncomfortable." Tracy shifted tactics, trying to bring the conversation back to what she framed as neutral ground. She asked about Miley's musical influences for her latest album, the production process, the themes she was exploring. For a moment, it seemed like the interview might recover. Miley began to talk about her music, about the emotional journey of creating the album. Her voice softened slightly, but then Tracy made another critical error. "It sounds like this album is more mature than some of your previous work," Tracy said, "more thoughtful, more restrained. Is that fair to say?" Miley's eyes narrowed. The brief respite in tension evaporated instantly. More mature than what exactly? Miley asked. Which previous work are you referring to? Because I've been making music for years, and I've poured my heart and soul into all of it. So when you say this is more mature, more thoughtful, more restrained, what you're really saying is that my other work was immature, thoughtless, and lacking restraint. Do you see how that's insulting? Tracy stammered, trying to explain that she meant it as a compliment, that she was trying to acknowledge Miley's growth. But Miley wasn't having it. A compliment would be saying the album is powerful, moving, well-crafted. A compliment would be discussing what makes it work on its own merits. What you did was compare it to my past work in a way that diminishes that past work. You're still doing the same thing you've been doing this whole interview, just with prettier words. The interview had now been going on for longer than its scheduled segment. Tracy made one more attempt to find common ground. Miley, I apologize if my questions have come across as judgmental. That truly wasn't my intention. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about your career and your evolution as an artist. Miley took a deep breath, and when she responded, her voice was calmer but no less firm. I appreciate that you're saying that, but intentions don't erase impact. Your questions, regardless of how you intended them, have been framed in a way that puts me in a position of having to defend myself, explain myself, justify myself. And here's the thing, I don't owe anyone that. I don't owe you that. I don't owe the audience that. My art speaks for itself. My life is my own. Tracy nodded slowly, but there was a tightness around her eyes. She tried to guide the conversation toward safer territory, asking about Miley's upcoming tour dates and what fans could expect. It seemed like a simple enough question, purely logistical. Miley answered, providing details about cities and dates, talking about the staging and the set. For a few minutes, the interview resembled what it was supposed to be, but then Tracy circled back. Will you be performing any of your older hits? The songs that people know and love from your earlier albums? In the context of everything that had already happened, it felt loaded. Miley clearly felt that way too. Of course I'll be performing older songs, Miley said. I'm proud of my catalog. But I notice you phrased that as songs people know and love. As if the new material isn't worth knowing, isn't worth loving. Do you see how even in a simple question about a tour, you're centering my past over my present? Tracy looked genuinely confused, insisting that she was just asking about the set list, that most artists perform a mix of old and new material. Miley pressed her point. Yes, most artists do a mix, and when you ask them about it, you usually ask what songs they're most excited to perform, or how they're balancing old and new material. You don't specifically emphasize the old songs as the ones people know and love. The language matters, Tracy. The framing matters. The audience was completely silent. Tracy looked at her notes, then at the camera, then back at Miley. When she spoke again, there was frustration in her voice. Miley, I have to be honest with you. I'm sitting here trying to conduct an interview, and it feels like everything I say is being interpreted in the worst possible light. I'm not your enemy. I'm not trying to attack you. I'm just doing my job. Miley leaned forward, her expression intense. And I'm just trying to exist as an artist without constantly being put in a box or having my worth measured by how well I conform to other people's expectations. You say you're doing your job, and I believe you. But your job, as you're doing it right now, involves asking questions that perpetuate harmful narratives about women in entertainment. Tracy looked off camera, presumably at producers, then back at Miley. The silence stretched on. Finally, Tracy spoke. I think we might just have to agree to disagree on this. Miley's response was immediate. That's what people say when they don't want to actually engage with what's being said. We can agree to disagree about subjective things. We can't agree to disagree about whether the questions you're asking perpetuate double standards. That's not an opinion, that's an observable pattern. And dismissing it as a difference of opinion is exactly the kind of thing that allows these patterns to continue. Tracy sat back in her chair, seemingly at a loss for words. When she finally spoke, her voice had taken on a more formal tone. Well, I think our viewers can see that you're very passionate about these issues, Tracy said, and the word passionate immediately registered on Miley's face as yet another dismissive phrase. Passionate, Miley repeated. Yes, I'm passionate. I'm also right, and the fact that you're reducing what I'm saying to passion proves my point. When men speak forcefully, they're articulate, they're commanding. When women do it, we're passionate, we're emotional. Tracy held up her hand. I'm not trying to dismiss what you're saying, but I think you're attributing motives to my questions that simply aren't there. Sometimes, a question is just a question. Miley laughed without humor. A question is never just a question, Tracy. Every question comes from a perspective, carries assumptions. The questions you've chosen today tell a story where my value as an artist is secondary to my history as a spectacle. Tracy made another attempt to redirect, asking about Miley's philanthropic work and activism, but given everything that had transpired, even this felt calculated. Now we're going to talk about my charity work, Miley asked. After questioning my integrity and motives, Now you want to talk about the good things I do. You don't get to tear someone down and then ask about their charity work to end on a positive note. Tracy looked into the camera. I think what we're seeing is a fundamental disagreement about journalism. Part of my job is to ask challenging questions. If every interview was just softballs, what would be the value? Challenging questions are great, Miley responded. Ask me about my creative process, about the messages in my music, about how I've navigated the industry. What you've been doing is asking me to defend my existence, to justify my choices. There's a huge difference. Tracy pushed back. I've interviewed countless artists, and I approach each conversation with respect. If you felt attacked, I'm sorry you felt that way, but that wasn't my intention. Miley shook her head. You're sorry I felt that way. Not sorry for how the questions were framed. That's not an apology, Tracy. That's putting the responsibility back on me. Tracy's jaw tightened. I think we've reached a point where this has become more about our disagreement than about your work. What would make this conversation feel productive to you? What would make this productive is if we could have an honest reckoning with what's happened instead of just moving past it. Miley said, this is about a pattern with women in entertainment, where we're held to different standards, asked different questions. Until we acknowledge that, nothing changes. Tracy sighed audibly, and it would later become a point of discussion on social media. You just sighed at me, Miley said quietly. On national television, while I'm trying to articulate something important, you audibly sighed. Do you understand how dismissive that is? Tracy started to explain she was just tired, but Miley raised her hand. That sigh perfectly encapsulates this entire interview. I'm talking about something that matters, and the response is exhaustion. Can we just move on? That's exactly the problem. Tracy looked off camera for direction, then turned back. Miley, I want to thank you for coming on the show today. Your new album is available now, and you'll be touring this summer. That's it. Miley asked, we're just going to wrap it up like everything's fine. Like we just had a normal conversation. I think what's happening right now is the most important part, Miley said, speaking to the camera. This is what always happens. Women speak up, women push back, and then everyone just wants to move on without addressing what was said. And then another woman will sit in a chair like this and get asked the same kinds of questions, and the cycle continues. Tracy tried to mention time constraints, but Miley kept going. I don't regret coming here today. I don't regret speaking up, because maybe someone watching will recognize the patterns I'm talking about. Maybe someone will think twice about the assumptions they make. Maybe this conversation will actually lead to something changing. Tracy spoke one more time. Well, that's certainly a powerful statement to end on. Miley didn't respond. She just sat there, looking at Tracy, then at the camera. The show cut to commercial. This interview would be dissected for weeks, with people taking sides, debating the nature of celebrity journalism and the treatment of women in media. And that's what happened when Miley Cyrus sat down with Tracy Smith on CBS Sunday morning and refused to play by the expected rules. Make sure you subscribe to the channel and drop a comment below telling me whose side you're on. Do you think Miley was right to push back so forcefully, or do you think she overreacted to standard interview questions? Let me know what you think.